On this indictment, you are jointly charged with inflicting grievous bodily harm contrary to Section 18 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. And the particulars are that you, Alan Bryley, and you, David Andrew Maybank, on the 17th of October 1975 at Fulchester, unlawfully inflicted grievous bodily harm on Josie Williams with intent so to do.
David Maybank, a consultant neurosurgeon, has performed an operation on the brain of Josie Williams in order to make her less violent and aggressive. Dr. Alan Bryley is the psychiatrist who recommended that Josie should have the operation. In a private prosecution brought by another psychiatrist called Dr. Joan Reedman, both men are charged with inflicting grievous bodily harm on Josie Williams. The jury in this trial has been selected from members of the public whose names appeared in the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service.
Dr. Joan Reedman.
Dr. Reedman, you are a psychiatrist working at Wesley Hall, Workhampton.
Yes, I am.
What are your qualifications, Dr. Reedman?
I'm a doctor of medicine, a bachelor of surgery, and I hold a diploma in psychological medicine. For the past 8 years, I've been a psychoanalyst, specializing in group therapy.
Could you tell us what your work involves, Dr. Reedman?
Yes, Wesley Hall is not a mental hospital, it's a therapeutic community. We work with people who are going through some sort of personal crisis, like a nervous breakdown. We encourage them to talk about themselves in groups, and in this way they come to understand themselves and their problems.
Did a woman named Josie Williams come under your care a few years ago?
Yes, she did, about 5 years ago. She was having trouble with the police, and her social worker brought her to see me.
What kind of person was Mrs. Williams when you met her?
Oh, she had a very striking personality. She was lively, vivacious, intelligent. I liked her. She stood up for herself. But she was also very stubborn and self-willed, and of course she had a formidable temper.
What was your diagnosis of her condition?
Diagnosis. I'm afraid I don't like fitting diagnostic labels to my patients unless they're mentally ill, and Josie Williams was not mentally ill. She was disturbed, upset, but then her personal circumstances were extremely difficult. She was alone, trying to bring up her family in appalling circumstances, and she had the kind of personality that kept getting her into trouble. She had, if you like, personality and character difficulties, but she was not mentally ill.
Now, I believe she continued to attend Wesley Hall until about 1973.
Yes, that's right.
And after she left in 1973, when did you next see her?
She turned up at Wesley Hall again in February this year.
And how did she strike you then?
Oh, I was shocked by the change in her personality. She seemed somehow flat. She was very slow. She used to be very quick. She was quiet, subdued, hesitant. Her speech didn't flow as it used to. It came in fits and starts, and she was suffering from partial amnesia. She came to see me, in fact, because she couldn't remember part of her childhood. She said it was like having a hole in her memory. And she thought it had been a very happy memory and felt a great sense of loss that it wasn't there anymore.
Well, it sounds as if Mrs. Williams had changed a great deal from the person who had attended Wesley Hall 3 years before.
Oh, yes, she certainly had.
Did you discover what had happened to her to bring about this change?
Yes, she told me that she'd been a patient of Dr. Bryley's and that she'd had an operation on her brain to stop her temper tantrums. In other words, she'd been a victim of psychosurgery.
Now, what does the term psychosurgery mean?
It's an operation performed on the brain by one human being in order to change the personality and behavior of another human being.
And what action did you take on hearing that Mrs. Williams had had such an operation?
Well, I knew they were experimenting with psychosurgery in America and Japan in order to control aggressive behavior, but I'd no idea they were doing it over here. So I phoned Dr. Bryley and asked him what they'd done to her.
What did Dr. Bryley say?
He told me that she'd had an amygdalotomy.
An amygdalotomy?
Yes. The amygdala is a small area deep inside the brain which is thought to control aggressive behavior. They had drilled a hole in Josie's skull, inserted a probe, and destroyed the amygdala.
Can we take it that you did not approve of psychosurgery for Mrs. Williams?
No, I certainly did not.
In your view, are there any circumstances in which psychosurgery is justified?
I think our understanding of the brain is really inadequate to justify psychosurgery, unless there's evidence of brain damage. And I also think the notion of operating for aggressive behaviour carries serious moral, political and ethical implications. And for these reasons, I think it's not justified.
Now, Dr. Bryley diagnosed that Mrs. Williams's case was serious persisting aggression of an intractable nature. In what sense is the word intractable used here?
It means a serious chronic disorder, considered incurable where all other treatments have failed.
Did you consider that Mrs. Williams was suffering from an intractable disorder, Dr. Reedman?
No, she certainly wasn't.
Would you say that some psychiatrists could have seen her condition as intractable?
No, I think no psychiatrist looking at the matter objectively would have thought that. I think she's been a victim of psychiatrists and a victim of male prejudice.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's considerable research in America to indicate that women are subjected to psychosurgery far more often than men. They're easily subjected to the authority of husband, physician, male father figure, if you like, to take responsibility for them, to look after them and so on. Such women have always been the target for whatever treatment doctors happen to be currently promoting, whether it's drugs or electric shocks or now psychosurgery. In Canada, one doctor was told not to operate on male patients because of adverse publicity, but he was allowed to operate on 17 women patients. That was blatant prejudice. And this is just prejudice.
Miss Scott, I'm getting a little confused as to whether we're trying the concept of psychosurgery or sexual discrimination or the defendants here. We really must get on with the substantive issues in question.
I believe that sexual discrimination is an issue in this case. I'm trying to establish Dr. Bryley's underlying reasons for deciding that Mrs. Williams was suffering from an intractable mental illness.
You mean to say that because of sexual prejudice, a psychiatrist could diagnose a patient as having a serious mental illness?
Indeed, my lord. It is my case that the defendant's general view of women led them to believe that Mrs. Williams' propensity for violence was a symptom of an intractable mental illness rather than an expression of her personality in the circumstances in which she found herself.
Oh, very well, go on.
Thank you, my lord. Now, Dr. Reedman, Mrs. Williams was said to have been suffering from a severe aggressive personality disorder. Do you agree that this was the case?
Well, she sometimes showed aggressive behaviour, certainly. She'd attacked her mother. She had fights in pubs. She had fights at Wesley Hall. But aggression itself is not proof of mental illness. And our society is a violent society. Look at the thousands of men who go to prison for violence, serve their time, come out and lead relatively normal lives.
Are you saying that had Mrs. Williams been a man, her violence would not have been considered abnormal?
If Mrs. Williams had been a man, her violence may have been considered abnormal, and she may have been punished for it. But she would certainly not have been considered mentally ill, and definitely not intractably mentally ill.
Thank you, Dr. Reedman.
Surely, Dr. Reedman, you would agree that when Mrs. Williams came to see you this year, she was, in fact, happier than she had been before the operation.
Well, if happiness is justification, we could give everybody hashish for breakfast every morning and have a very happy nation.
So you agree she was happier?
I didn't say that. She wasn't reacting strongly to things that at one time would have made her react strongly. Her emotions were deadened.
Well, when you asked her how she was, did she say she was better?
She said that she'd had an operation and that they'd made her better.
So she did say she was better?
She said that they had made her better.
Yes, yes, thank you, Dr. Reedman. She wanted to be better, didn't she?
It's not as simple as that. This formerly lively, vivacious, intelligent girl was now subdued and placid with her personality blunted. As far as I'm concerned, that's not a cure. That's not a change for the better. That's simply making a patient easy to manage.
Did you tell Mrs. Williams this?
Yes, I did.
And what was her reaction?
She was confused.
She didn't agree with you then?
I said she was confused.
Dr. Reedman, we must answer counsel's question.
When you told Mrs. Williams, in your opinion, what had happened to her, did she agree?
She neither agreed nor disagreed.
So she wasn't angry with Mr. Maybank or Dr. Bryley for what you said they had done to her?
No, but then she'd supposedly had her so-called anger mechanism destroyed, so what would you expect?
What did you do for her, Dr. Reedman? What treatment did you give her?
If you're referring to the all-too-common practice of doling out drugs and electric shocks on a vast and random scale, as they appear to do in most of our mental institutions, then we didn't give her any physical treatment.
So what did you do for her?
She took part in group discussions. I think she came to understand her behaviour a little. We were trying to find a way for her to channel her energy in a constructive rather than a destructive way.
Yes. Now, after she left Wesley Hall and came to Fulchester, she was admitted to Northcliffe Mental Hospital under the care of Dr. Bryley. Now, he diagnosed serious, persistent aggression of an intractable nature. Now, of course, you hadn't seen Mrs. Williams during this period, and her condition might have deteriorated, even if we assume your diagnosis was correct.
No, the basic problem would have remained the same. She wouldn't have developed any organic brain disorder.
Well, let's just look at her medical history, shall we? My lord, these documents have been agreed between the two parties. Have you any objection to them being used?
No, Miss Better, no.
And Dr. Reedman, will you look for a moment at the file?
Thank you.
Now, does that contain the medical records for Mrs. Williams, which you saw when she came to the centre?
Yes, and some subsequent entries.
Yes, well, can we just examine some of the earlier entries first, Dr. Reedman? When she was 15, she was put into a remand home for non-school attendance and shoplifting. She was later moved to an approved school where the warden reports she was violent, unruly, wayward, stubborn, rude, given to outbreaks of temper tantrums, attempts to abscond, and was a thoroughly bad influence on the other girls. Now, do you not consider these were early signs of mental disturbance?
Well, no, not when you consider the Victorian and sadistic attitudes of the warden of that school. I think Josie should be commended for fighting back.
I see. So you do not agree that these were early symptoms of mental disturbance?
No, I don't.
Well, we have a report here from the Lodge Mental Hospital where Mrs. Williams was a patient before she came to you. This is an agreed document. They say Mrs. Williams is given to periods of morbid depression, mania, outbursts of abusive rage. Now, later she was discharged from the lodge, and 2 years later she came to you. Now, as I understand your evidence, you are saying she would have been better off if she'd stayed with you, instead of leaving and subsequently going to Dr. Bryley.
Yes.
Could you tell me, Dr. Reedman, why, if your treatment was so good, why, after Mrs. Williams left you, did her violent behaviour patterns continue? To such an extent, she was brought before the courts again, was referred to Dr. Bryley, and subsequently spent 2 years in Northcliffe Mental Hospital. You were unable to cure Mrs. Williams, weren't you, Dr. Reedman?
You insist in talking in terms of a cure. Personalities are not like that. Helping people is a very slow process. I think Mrs. Williams was helped to a certain extent by Wesley Hall, but her circumstances were against her. She had 3 children, very little money, and no husband. Even Josie's mother didn't help. She refused to understand the treatment and kept telling her it was a waste of time.
So Mrs. Williams did, in fact, have an intractable disorder?
No, it was her circumstances that were intractable, not her disorder. They were the kind of circumstances under which many supposedly normal people might crack up or behave violently.
Finally, Dr. Reedman, you have made strong allegations that Mr. Maybank and Dr. Bryley are guilty of sexual discrimination. Do you have any evidence at all to support this fanciful notion?
All I can say is that I think that their judgment in this case was biased due to their sexist attitudes and expectations of women.
Now, why do you say that?
I can see no other way that they could arrive at the diagnosis of serious intractable aggression and have considered that Josie Williams needed a brain operation.
Really? I see.
Professor Westgate, you hold a chair at the medical school at Fulchester University.
I do, yes.
But would you tell us in simple terms what was entailed in the operation which Mrs. Williams underwent?
Well, it's not easy, but I'll try to simplify it. Could you pass me my head?
Your head?
It's a visual aid I use for teaching, my lord.
Oh, I see. Well, is this necessary? After all, this is not a medical seminar.
No, my lord, but I think it will help the jury to understand what is not an easy subject.
Oh, very well. Keep it simple, please.
Now, the brain is contained in a solid cranium vault here. When the skull is partially removed, we see the cerebral hemispheres. That's these bits.
Do keep it simple, Professor.
Yes, I'll do my best. Now, the operation that Mrs. Williams had took place in this area here known as the limbic system, one of the oldest parts of the brain, and It appears to be the centre of emotion.
Appears? You mean it is not certain?
Well, the brain structures are very complex, and the connections between the organic structures and the emotional and behavioural responses of what we feel, how we feel, what we do, are still not fully understood.
I see.
To put it rather poetically, this mechanism here is thought to be the mechanism by which the brain transforms the cold light which we see into the warm light which we feel.
Professor Westgate, I think we're in quite enough difficulty trying to cope with anatomy and neurophysiology without confounding the matter by adding poetry.
Yes, of course, my lord. Yes, I'm sorry. Shall I go on?
Yes, please.
Now, connected to the limbic system is this almond-shaped entity here called the amygdala. Psychosurgical destruction of any part of the amygdala is known as amygdalotomy. Now, this is performed by means of a cryogenic probe which is inserted through a hole drilled in the skull and directed to the amygdala by this three-dimensional frame, which, as you can see, is fixed to the skull by small pins. Now, part of the amygdala is now destroyed either by electric current or by deep freezing with liquid nitrogen. And that is the operation performed on Mrs. Williams by Mr. Maybank.
Professor Westgate, what happens if this part of the brain is destroyed?
Well, we're not altogether sure because we don't know enough about it. But the amygdala appears to have an influence on all the emotional responses. And in particular, it is believed to influence the expression of the emotion anger and fear. In animal experiments, where the whole of the amygdala was destroyed, the animals became docile and placid. Monkeys, who were dominant in a monkey colony, became submissive and unable to protect themselves, so that they were attacked and eaten by other species.
How does an amygdalotomy affect humans?
The same as animals, but I've never known a patient to be eaten by cannibals or other predators.
Professor Westgate, whilst I recognise the fact that light relief can be an acceptable way of holding the attention of undergraduates, it will only inhibit our attempts to concentrate on the rather difficult concepts with which you are confronting us.
I'm sorry, my lord. Yes.
Yes, Miss Scott.
So one could expect that the amygdalotomy would have caused Mrs. Williams to be quiet, subdued, and hesitant in her behaviour.
Well, yes, one could expect it, but in some cases it didn't happen. And psychosurgeons went on operating and destroying other parts of the limbic system until the desired effect was achieved.
Now, you have just said that the limbic system is not yet fully understood. Would you say that medical science knows enough to perform this operation?
Well, psychosurgery is a highly controversial issue in the medical world. Some doctors are dead against it on ethical grounds. Other doctors are for it in cases of severe, intractable mental illness, and others would like to see it more widely used for political reasons, a prospect which horrifies many freedom-loving people.
Yes, I gather there is some controversy about the procedures involved in these psychosurgical operations.
Well, the surgeons don't seem able to agree on which is the best bit of the brain to destroy. And come to that, which is the mental disorder which is suitable for psychosurgery at all. There was a case of a person having psychosurgery for obsessive gambling. There was an article published in The Lancet recommending psychosurgery for sex offenders, because castration was open to criticism on ethical grounds. From this, it would appear that man's brain is less sacrosanct than his testicles. I beg your pardon, my lord.
I have no further questions, my lord.
Professor Westgate, you are saying that psychosurgery is a highly contentious issue.
Yes. A World Health Organization report published this year considered it to be a dubious procedure and ethically doubtful. It was considered by an American court of law to be experimental and high risk.
But psychosurgery is not illegal, is it, Professor Westgate?
Well, there's no legislation prohibiting it in this country at the present time, so I suppose this is something of a test case.
Surely you would agree that many people have benefited a great deal from psychosurgery.
Well, some people appeared to have benefited.
In fact, the number of people who have benefited far outnumbers those who have not.
Well, it's impossible to say. There's no detailed scientific research.
But psychosurgery has a long and respectable history.
Has it? Lobotomies were performed on vast numbers of peoples in the 40s and 50s.
One moment. What is a leucotomy?
A lobotomy is an operation where the surgeon severs the nerve tract connecting the sections of the frontal lobes of the brain, that's this part here, from the rest of the brain. This technique fell into disrepute when the adverse after effects became apparent. Over half the lobotomized patients suffered from epileptic fits. There was a high incidence of incontinence reported. And, of course, the usual emotional disorders, apathy, impaired intellect, confused thinking, and so on.
But surely, Professor Westgate, that was the original or so-called standard operation carried out with a knife. Now, is it not a fact that modern electrical methods have ruled out these adverse after effects?
If you're talking about stereotaxic brain surgery, we do not know that this method has ruled out adverse after effects, and improvements are far from assured. All we know is that this method is more precise.
Well, perhaps we can consider this from an individual's point of view. Now, Mrs. Williams was a patient in great distress, suffering from a mental disorder. It may have meant her spending a considerable part of her life in a mental hospital. Now, we have the means at our disposal to help patients like Mrs. Williams. Now, surely we should do so.
Well, I was unacquainted with Mrs. Williams before this case, so I can't comment on her condition, though I understand it's in dispute. I can only answer you by saying I would not like to have to take such a decision.
But you would agree there are circumstances where psychosurgery is not only justifiable, but desirable.
Possibly. In rare cases of severe, intolerable anxiety where all other treatments have failed, it's vital that the patient gives consent to the operation voluntarily, be made fully familiar with what the operation entails, that it is of a highly contentious nature, regarded as experimental in some circles, that it has possible adverse after effects, operational hazards, personality changes, partial amnesia, diminution of learning ability, loss of the sense of self.
But if the patient has consented voluntarily, as Mrs. Williams did in this case, you would have no objections.
Well, performing psychosurgery to control aggressive behaviour is a relatively new departure in the field of psychosurgery. I would have strong moral qualms about condoning such surgical intervention.
But there are some cases where it would be justifiable to perform this operation.
Very few, I should think.
The cases in Fulchester are fictitious. Join us tomorrow when Reedman versus Maybank and Bryley will be resumed in the Crown Court. David Maybank, a consultant neurosurgeon, has performed an operation on the brain of Josie Williams in order to make her less violent and aggressive. Dr. Alan Bryley is the psychiatrist who recommended that Josie should have the operation. In a private prosecution brought by another psychiatrist called Dr. Joan Reedman, both men have been charged with inflicting grievous bodily harm on Josie Williams. The jury in this trial has been selected from members of the public, whose names appeared on the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service. At the start of the second day of the trial, Josie Williams is about to give evidence.
You are Mrs. Josie Williams, and you live with your 3 children at 103 Seaford Road, Fulchester.
Yes.
And you had an operation on your brain on October the 17th, 1975. Is that correct, Mrs. Williams?
Yes.
At whose suggestion was this operation performed?
Dr. Bryley suggested it.
Now, I'd like you to try and remember the time that he suggested it and tell us what happened.
I can't remember it very well. I was drugged.
What do you mean, Mrs. Williams? Who had drugged you?
They give you drugs every day in the North Cliff.
Oh, I see. And how did the drugs affect you, Mrs. Williams?
I was a bit stupid.
And what exactly do you mean by stupid?
Well, have you ever been on Largap Till?
Well, no. Perhaps you could tell us what it's like.
Not quite with it.
I see. Yes, Miss Scott?
Mrs. Williams, can you remember what Dr. Bryley said when you went to see him?
He told me about this operation on my brain, that they were going to destroy a bit of it.
Did he say what the operation was for?
To make me feel better and to make me less violent.
What else did he say?
Well, we talked about it. All the times I've been in and out of hospital, I was like a yo-yo, and it seemed better than spending the rest of my life in there.
Did Dr. Bryley say you'd have to spend the rest of your life in a mental hospital?
Well, we talked about it. He said there wasn't anything else they could do for me. They tried everything.
But did he actually say that unless you had the operation, you would spend the rest of your life in a mental hospital?
I can't remember. We talked about it, that's all.
I see. Yes, Miss Scott?
Did he say that he thought it was a good idea to have the operation?
Yes.
And what did he tell you about the effects of the operation?
He said that it would make me better. I think he said calmer.
Did he warn you that you might have problems with your memory?
Well, not that I can remember. But my memory isn't what it was. He said that I wouldn't get so angry about things. I couldn't control my temper, you see.
Did he say it might not work?
Oh, I can't remember. He might have done, I'm not sure.
Well, did he say that it might make you worse?
No, he just said that it'd make me less angry.
Did he say anything else?
I can't remember. I think we talked a bit about me kids. I'd be better for them. I would be a nicer person.
How do you mean, a nicer person?
We'll not get so angry.
How did you react when Dr. Bryley told you about the operation on your brain?
It's just another thing.
You mean another treatment?
Yeah, well, they were always trying out things. I mean, I'd had loads of electric shocks and all those different drugs they wanted to try out. I just used to sit back and wait to see what happened to me.
Now, Mrs. Williams, I'd like you to try and tell us how you felt after you had had the operation.
Oh, I couldn't converse at all at first. I couldn't talk to anyone. I was getting frightened. I was scared that I might be like a human vegetable because I couldn't converse. I mean, I couldn't remember a thing, not even things that had just happened. I was really confused.
How long did this condition last?
Oh, I don't know, really. I mean, I can talk better now. I can't talk like I used to. I mean, I'm definitely slower. I feel a bit behind now. I mean, I used to be in there and I could talk about anything. I could converse with any class. Well, that's gone now. I can remember most things now. Most things, not everything, but most things.
Have you changed in any other way?
I'm not nearly as tidy. I used to be fanatical. I had all this energy. I'd be up at all hours of the night doing things. Oh, I don't know, I had too much energy. I get confused sometimes, but I'm all right.
Have you lost your temper since the operation?
No. It's not like me not to. I mean, if I could just fly off the handle, I'd feel like it was the real me coming out. It's gone now, but there it is.
So you don't feel yourself?
Not really.
Did you expect the outcome of the operation to be like this?
I didn't really think. I just wanted to get out of there. I wanted to, I don't know.
Mrs. Williams, when you were discussing with Dr. Bryley whether or not you should have the operation, did he tell you that it might make you feel a different person?
I don't think so, but I can't really remember.
I see. Yes, Miss Scott?
Now, I'd like you to try and remember your past a little. Were you unusual in any way when you were a child? Were you different from other children?
Oh, I had 2 arms, 2 legs and a head. I was a bit of a tomboy.
Were you a violent child?
I had a temper. I stood up for myself.
Did you get into trouble much when you were a teenager?
I used to get into fights a lot.
Would you say that you were abnormal at that time?
Well, I got put in a remand home for shoplifting. You mean, was I mental?
Did you think there might be something wrong with you?
Well, when I got put in the nut house, I did. They said I had manic depression.
Now, you have mentioned that you had drugs and shock treatment in the mental hospital. Did you ever have psychotherapy?
We did that at Wesley Hall.
But not in the mental hospitals?
No, you just hang about all day in there. I mean, you talk to the psychiatrist a bit, but not like at Wesley Hall. They're too busy.
Mrs. Williams, you used to be quite an active person, didn't you? In fact, you were a fighting person who stood up for your rights. You had quite a battle with the Social Security.
Well, they expected me to bring up 3 kids on £10 a week. And they wouldn't believe me when I told them I was getting no money from their dad. And when you're on your own and you've got kids, it's no good just sitting in a chair.
And when you were living in appalling slum conditions, you didn't sit back, did you? You created a disturbance at your landlord's to draw attention to your plight, and you were subsequently taken to court.
Well, probably if I'd sat back, I would have been classed as normal. But when you're the one that fights, they think you're mad. And I used to be like that.
In fact, you did your best to cope under very difficult circumstances after your husband left you, didn't you? Now, your records indicate that you were a bit of a nuisance at Northcliffe. These are agreed, my lord. It says here that you stirred up other patients, you rang the fire bell several times to create a disturbance demanding to see your records, you refused to take prescribed drugs, and you attacked a nurse and a doctor. Do you ever get restless now?
Not like I used to.
Mrs. Williams, do you think you were mental?
No, I wasn't mental. Not like some of the poor buggers in there. I didn't imagine I was the Queen.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Will you wait there, please?
Mrs. Williams, have you been happier since the operation?
Happier than what?
Than since before the operation?
I'm in the middle now, I suppose.
You mean you don't get excitable, you don't have violent rages?
Yes.
Well, then surely you are happier now. You do not present yourself as a danger to anyone.
My learned friend is assuming that Mrs. Williams was a dangerous person. This has certainly not been established as a fact.
In that case, let us look at Mrs. Williams' records, shall we? Mrs. Williams, when you were 15, you attacked the warden of the approved school you attended with a wooden sandal. Is that correct?
It was a Dr. Scholes.
Another time you attacked the same man with a potty.
There's only a potty in the room.
While in the same approved school, you cut your own arms with a kitchen knife and later used the knife to deface the walls of the kitchen. Is that true?
Well, I thought that if I cut myself, that they'd send me away to a hospital or something.
I see. When you were 19, you got into trouble with the police quite often. You smashed a police station window and scratched the face of the policeman who later attempted to restrain you.
Yes.
It seems you were picked up off the streets frequently for being drunk and abusive, weren't you, Mrs. Williams?
Years ago.
And when you were a patient at the Lodge Mental Hospital, you made a violent attack on a nurse. So violent was this attack, she had to call for help. You had to be heavily sedated.
Well, I heard her telling this student who was working there that I was a vicious psychopath and not to be trusted, and I was cold-blooded. I was never like that. I wasn't mental.
So you viciously attacked people who called you names, Mrs. Williams. Well, isn't that the behaviour of a vicious psychopath?
Well, he was my friend. I liked him.
We also have a report here of a time you viciously attacked your own mother. In fact, you broke her arm, didn't you? Now, surely you must agree, Mrs. Williams, these attacks were far worse than those of a person with just a bad temper.
I got struck dumb. I was no good verbally when I was mad. I mean, my only defence is... some people can be violent with their tongues, but I wasn't like that. It was my only defence. I used to frighten myself sometimes.
You used to frighten yourself sometimes. Well, you certainly managed to frighten other people. Now, you knew the operation was going to stop these aggressive outbursts when you gave your consent, didn't you?
Yes.
Yes. You were in great distress before the operation, so much so you were unable to be a proper mother to your children, weren't you?
I wanted to go home and look after them.
Well, yes, of course you did. You wanted to be normal, didn't you? That is why you gave your consent to the operation, as a last, desperate attempt to lead a normal life.
I used to think that normal people were cabbages. I just wanted to be me.
TV lawyers.
The evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Bryley, you are a psychiatrist and you are working at Northcliffe Mental Hospital in Fulchester.
That is correct.
Yes. How long have you been a psychiatrist?
25 years. I've been at Northcliffe for 15 of them.
So you have considerable experience in this field?
Yes.
Yes. Now, when did you first meet Mrs. Williams?
Josie Williams first came to Northcliffe in great distress about 3 years ago.
Now, apart from her distress, what was the reason for her coming?
She'd been referred by the courts. There'd been some trouble over her landlord. We were sent her records from the previous hospital she'd attended, and she certainly had a long history of psychiatric illness.
And what was your opinion of Mrs. Williams at that time?
Well, I was forced to conclude that here was a case of serious, intractable aggression, extremely serious. She showed signs of tension, anxiety, excitable, impulsive behavior, bristling hostility. I think that so far in this court, the extent to which Mrs. Williams was disturbed has been vastly underestimated. In my view, she was psychiatrically crippled and completely unable to lead a normal life.
Now, Dr. Bryley, you've heard Dr. Reedman describe Mrs. Williams' personality as lively, vivacious, intelligent, self-willed, stubborn. Do you agree with this description?
I would say that it's a very idealized description. Mrs. Williams was a woman of perhaps average intelligence, very excitable and given to extreme outbursts. Perhaps that's what Dr. Reedman meant by vivacious. Stubborn and self-willed, I would agree with, yes, and of course she had an uncontrollable and irrational temper. Dr. Reedman seems to have forgotten that in her eagerness to praise. In my view, it's criminal to idealize her personality in such a way when it was quite clearly crippling her ability to lead a normal life. And of course, Dr. Reedman seems to have ignored the distress Josie Williams was causing her family. Her children and her poor mother were under considerable pressure. In fact, I was having to treat her mother with tranquilizers to help her to cope.
Now, would you say that Mrs. Williams' unstable character was due to her circumstances?
Well, her circumstances may well have played a part, but I know of people who've had very disturbed childhoods and far worse adult experiences than Mrs. Williams, who are now happily married and leading a normal life. I also know of people who have had everything life can offer. You might get a millionaire who says, "Oh, why do I feel like this, doctor? I'm in perfect physical health, I'm wealthy, my wife is the envy of other men, my 2 sons have won scholarships to Cambridge, I have everything, and yet I get these profound attacks of depression." You see, in cases like these, the psychiatric condition clearly has no connection with the patient's environmental circumstances or background.
So you do not think that Mrs. Williams' condition had anything at all to do with her circumstances?
Definitely not. Not her circumstances alone. They may have played a part, but only a very minor part.
Yes. Now, how well did you know Mrs. Williams before you suggested psychosurgery?
She'd been a patient at Northcliffe for 2 years, and as I've said, I also had her medical records.
So you knew her very well?
Indeed I did, yes.
Yes. Why did you suggest psychosurgery?
We'd tried all other forms of treatment. Nothing had any lasting effect on her. Her illness was intractable. There was ample evidence in her records of its chronic nature. It was a last resort. I might add that Mrs. Williams herself was pleading for help. She had no desire to live in a mental institution for the rest of her life. It was my duty as her doctor to do all that I could to help her.
Well, yes, of course. Now, would you say that in the case of Mrs. Williams, psychosurgery has been a success?
Yes, I would. She's no longer a patient at Northcliffe. She's been able to go home and lead a normal life. In my view, that rates success. I don't really understand what all this fuss is about.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bryley. No more questions.
Dr. Bryley, Mrs. Williams has told us that she was under the influence of the drug Largactil when you suggested psychosurgical treatment to her. Was this the case?
She was being prescribed Largactil at the time, yes, but that wouldn't affect her judgment or her memory. She was also on a reduced dose. I had it reduced because I wanted to talk to her about the operation. I had no desire to trick her into consenting, if that's what you're getting at.
I'm suggesting, Dr. Bryley, that Mrs. Williams wasn't in a fit condition to give her consent to a major operation, or to understand the complexities of this particular operation you suggested to her.
Using my professional judgment based on 25 years of working with mental patients, I can assure you that Mrs. Williams was perfectly able to give her consent.
I understand that Mrs. Williams was entirely at liberty to refuse, in which case the operation would never have been performed. Did she at any time refuse?
No.
Did she seem a little uncertain?
Well, naturally, she was weighing up the arguments.
Well, Mrs. Williams said she wasn't.
Well, I'm afraid she was.
Are you saying that Mrs. Williams is lying?
I discussed the pros and cons with her, and she considered them.
Oh, she understood the arguments, the pros and cons, did she?
I would say so, yes.
You would say that the arguments could be understood by a drugged, psychiatrically disturbed woman who, in your opinion, was suffering from an extreme, intractable mental illness and who, in your opinion, was only of average intelligence.
I put the arguments to her extremely simply.
Well, would you tell the jury, Dr. Bryley, the arguments that you put to Mrs. Williams in the same way that you did on that occasion?
Well, I would ask her how she was feeling and say a little about that. This usually results in the patient becoming distressed about not getting better. There is one treatment which we resort to in severe cases which involves an operation on the brain. Now, this can help patients in your condition, and it has done in the past. If you're willing, we could try it. You see, in your brain, there is a tiny area which controls aggression. That's your aggressive behavior. And the operation involves a surgeon passing an electric current into your brain which destroys that tiny area which controls aggression. Now, this should stop you having your violent outbursts and make you calmer and more able to lead a normal life. It may make you less energetic, and you won't react to things which now cause you so much distress in such an extreme way. It may affect your memory temporarily, but that will go in time. It is a major operation, but it has a good success rate. Now, the decision about whether to have it or not is entirely up to you. And I would finish by saying perhaps you would like to think about it.
So you didn't then mention the possibilities that her memory might be affected permanently, she might lose her sense of self, and she might suffer a diminution in her learning ability.
No, I do not accept that amygdalotomies have these effects. Her memory is improving. It's a matter of time.
Well, in any event, you were asking Mrs. Williams to take a major decision.
Yes, of course. But she had several weeks to make up her mind. She wasn't being asked to make a snap decision.
Now, violence is a general term, including a multitude of phenomena, is it not? Soldiers going into attack under orders, naughty children being punished by their parents, brawling in pubs, a man beating up his wife, and so on. These could all be said to be acts of violence. Violence being the result of the interaction between the individual and his or her environment. Now, some people may be violent under certain conditions, and some conditions may be so stressful as to make most people violent. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree with all those propositions with respect to some kinds of violence, but not where there's an underlying mental illness, something in the basic makeup of the person.
But you agree that violence is very much part of ordinary social and political conflict. And surely it is no part of a doctor's business to become an agent of social and political control.
On the contrary, the reality of most doctors' work includes acting as an agent of social control, if you like to put it that way. Doctors prevent infectious diseases from spreading by isolating the patient. Doctors lock up patients who are psychotic and do harm to others.
Are you saying that medical intervention can only be justified in cases when the violence displayed is undoubtedly based on a distinct mental illness?
Mrs. Williams' violence certainly was a symptom of a severe mental illness.
But if we look at Mrs. Williams' records, we can see that her violent outbursts were directed against her mother, a woman she may well have had good reason to feel animosity towards, against establishments such as the Social Security, and her landlord, who was abusing her and making her life stressful, against certain officials in mental hospitals, an unreal and stressful situation to be in. And furthermore, Dr. Bryley, if we study Mrs. Williams' records closely, we will see that indeed property was harmed more than people, and the person Mrs. Williams most harmed was herself. Now, would you not agree that rather than being random acts of violence by someone who was mentally ill, they were really quite typical for someone of Mrs. Williams' personality in those situations?
What made Mrs. Williams' condition pathological, in my professional opinion as a psychiatrist of some experience, was not her anger, but the extent of her anger. her thoroughly unstable personality, the extent of her misery. You didn't know her before the operation. You didn't see the condition she was in. I did.
Dr. Bryley, you only knew her behaviour in the context of a very large mental hospital, a place where you have to spread your valuable time amongst vast numbers of patients, and a place where Mrs. Williams may very well have been miserable.
I am a psychiatrist, and she had, of course, told me all about her life outside. I might add that when you hear a patient saying to you, "Doctor, I'm afraid of myself, I'm afraid of what I might do to someone," then you take note.
And the result of your taking note was to recommend her for a brain operation.
I have said that psychosurgery is a last resort.
I see. You mean you were thoroughly fed up with Mrs. Williams and you couldn't think of anything else, so you sent her along to Mr. Maybank.
No, I have said psychosurgery is a last resort and performed in the patient's best interests.
And would you have considered psychosurgery to be in the best interests of the patient had Mrs. Williams been a man?
Well, I have, when the situation warranted it. Also recommended men for psychosurgical treatment, but men are different from women.
In what way are men different from women?
Well, I thought that was pretty obvious. Physically, biologically, and consequently behaviourally.
Do you believe that men are more aggressive than women by nature?
I would say that's a fact of life.
Well, wouldn't you say that it is simply an habitual way of seeing women as a result of their different situations in society?
No, it's a scientific fact.
Oh, surely you mean, in your opinion, it is a scientific fact.
I don't know what odd notions might be floating around in your pretty head, but as far as I am concerned, it's common knowledge.
Do you think that it's unfeminine of a woman to express herself aggressively?
My lord, this is ridiculous.
I'm afraid you must answer counsel's question, Doctor.
What was it again?
Do you think that it's unfeminine of a woman to behave aggressively?
Yes, I do, but that has nothing whatever to do with my diagnosis of Mrs. Williams.
I suggest that it had everything to do with why you considered her to be intractably mentally ill. In fact, she was continually displaying personality characteristics which you yourself don't like to see in a woman.
Mrs. Williams' aggression was undoubtedly pathological, chronic, and intractable. And that is my professional opinion.
The cases in Fulchester are fictitious. Join us tomorrow when Reedman versus Maybank and Bryley will be concluded in the Crown Court. David Maybank, a neurosurgeon, have been charged with inflicting grievous bodily harm following an operation, which, on Bryley's recommendation, Maybank performed on the brain of a woman called Josie Williams. The operation was intended to make Mrs. Williams less violent and aggressive. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Joan Reedman, has brought a private prosecution, alleging that the violent outbursts were justifiable anger and that Josie Williams has been a victim of male prejudice. The jury in this trial has been selected from members of the public, whose names appeared on the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service. The trial is now in its third day, and the surgeon, David Maybank, is just going into the witness box.
Mr. Maybank, did you perform the brain operation on Mrs. Williams on October the 17th, 1975?
An amygdalotomy, yes.
Yes. Had you met Mrs. Williams prior to the operation?
Oh, yes, a couple of times.
Yes. Would you please tell the court the purpose of these meetings?
Well, to talk to the patient about the operation and to calm any anxiety she might have. Sometimes a patient feels more confident if she's met the surgeon and has confidence in him as well as a person.
Yes. Did Mrs. Williams express any reservations?
No, not at all.
Well, what did you talk about then?
Well, we chatted over a cup of tea, and I told her about the operation. I told her it was to be on the amygdala, and I showed her a diagram of the brain that I keep in my office. I pointed the amygdala out to her and explained how we would do the operation. I told her about boring the little hole in the skull, about the electrode, that sort of thing. Yes, I told her we'd have to shave her head.
Did she ask any questions?
Yes, she asked if she'd be able to go home afterwards and if she'd get better.
She asked if she would be able to go home afterwards and if she would be better. What did you say?
I said there was every chance that she would be able to, yes. I said the operation had a very good success rate and had helped a lot of people.
Yes. Did you tell her about any possible bad after effects?
Such as?
Well, prosecution is claiming there are some bad after effects.
Yes, I know. Well, most of them I cannot accept. And the others cannot be regarded seriously within the context of the patient's illness. How can I tell a patient to beware of after effects I don't know about? There have been reports in medical history of patients of brain surgery dying or having a hemorrhage, but they're very rare. Some people die under anesthetic, having their appendix out. There's something like 1,000,000 to 1 chance against, but I'm quite sure the doctors don't tell all their potential patients about that chance. There's no point in frightening them unnecessarily.
Did you tell her in what way the operation would change her?
Yes. I told her that the amygdala was an area of the brain concerned with aggression. Not an operation on it would calm her, make her less aggressive, and more able to lead a normal life, which apparently it has done.
Yes. Mr. Maybank, how do patients come to you?
Well, when a psychiatrist like Dr. Bryley has a patient who hasn't responded to any other form of treatment, then they come to me as a last resort. The psychiatrist sends them.
Yes. Mr. Maybank, were you satisfied in your own mind that Mrs. Williams would benefit from psychosurgery?
Well, yes, I was satisfied. I knew that the operation had a very good success rate and it helped a lot of people. I had no reason to doubt that it would benefit Mrs. Williams. In fact, I think she has benefited from it. I haven't heard anything yet to suggest anything to the contrary.
Would you say, Mr. Maybank, there is a rather primitive fear of the brain which causes people to respond emotionally, irrationally, to the notion of a brain operation?
Oh, yes, there certainly is. One should have enormous respect for the brain, of course, just like any other part of the body. But I do realize that a lot of people look upon the brain as a particularly sacred part of the anatomy. There was the same feeling about hearts at one time. Seat of the soul, all that sort of thing.
Yes. Do you agree with the view that medical science does not know enough about the brain to perform these operations?
People who say we don't know enough about the brain anatomically are wrong. We don't know enough about the mind and the connection between the mind and the brain, yes. But that's no reason for not carrying out psychosurgery when we can more or less guarantee a fair success rate. And are these people supposed to wait in utter misery until they're finally found in a gas-filled room? Or until the experts tell us one day, all right, we know enough about the mind now, let's get on with it?
Thank you, Mr. Maybank. I have no further questions, my Lord.
Mr. Maybank, when you told Mrs. Williams you were going to shave her head, did she react?
No.
Didn't you think it strange that she didn't react to that? She had thick, curly, rather nice hair, don't you think?
Very nice hair, yes.
And she was going to have a bald head.
Well, it would grow again.
You didn't think her non-reaction was perhaps a symptom that she was under such a dosage of largactil that she wasn't really fit to give an informed consent?
That's silly. No, I didn't think that.
Mr. Maybank, you have been practicing as a surgeon for 20 years. Were you performing psychosurgical operations 20 years ago?
No, I was carrying out the occasional leucotomy then, yes.
By leucotomy, you mean surgically destroying part of the frontal lobes?
In essence, yes. We didn't have the modern electrical techniques then that we have now, of course.
Psychosurgery was believed to have largely died out in the early 60s, wasn't it?
Was it? Well, it certainly hadn't. The bottom dropped out of the leucotomy market, if that's what you mean, when tranquilizers came in. But it didn't stop altogether. There was no reason why it should.
Well, wouldn't you say, Mr. Maybank, that the reason the bottom fell out of the leucotomy market, as you so aptly put it, was because of the high failure rate and the high incidence of adverse after effects?
No, it wasn't. In the early days of leucotomy, and I mean the early days, there were a lot of very bad results because the surgeons at that time just didn't know what they were doing. They chose the wrong patients and the operations were altogether too destructive. But then the beginnings of most things are primitive, wouldn't you say? Nowadays, there's a vast literature not only on leucotomy, but on patients who've had all forms of psychosurgery. Therefore, when I was presented by Dr. Bryley with Mrs. Williams, who had not responded to any other form of treatment, well, I knew I could more or less guarantee that she would get better afterwards. Well, as apparently she has done.
I could more or less guarantee that she would get better. Now, you have mentioned the so-called high success rate of this operation before. Would you tell us what this high success rate is, taking your criteria of success?
About 70 to 80%.
70 to 80%. I see. So it has failed in 2 to 3 out of every 10 people you operate on. And Mrs. Williams is a measure of your success. Thank you, Mr. Maybank. Now, we have heard that before the operation, Mrs. Williams was lively, vivacious, intelligent, energetic and self-willed. Would you accept that description?
Certainly not when I met her. Perhaps there were these elements in her makeup, but the description completely overlooks the negative aspect, her aggressive problems, her depressions.
Well, whatever the starting point, do you agree that since the operation she is quieter, slower and more subdued?
Certainly there has been some blunting of the emotions, but that is the intention of the operation. When a person has hyperactivity or overactive emotions, causing pathological or abnormal behavior, well, this is the desired effect. I wouldn't call a certain amount of blunting of the emotions a bad after effect. But from your description, one would be led to suppose that we're producing some kind of a vegetable personality, which Mrs. Williams certainly does not have.
But you agree that these are the after effects of amygdalotomy?
No, I did not agree. I said that overactive emotions, in Mrs. Williams' case, her extreme aggressive behavior has been reduced. And I see no reason to put destructive behavior on some kind of a pedestal.
Are you saying that in order to lead a normal life, whatever a normal life may mean, it is preferable to have blunted emotions?
For some people who are made seriously mentally ill by overactive emotions, yes. It's all very well to intellectualize over these things, but a person with an agitated, depressive illness who's threatening to cut his throat isn't concerned with intellectual considerations. He's only interested in something being done about his profound depression. Otherwise, life has no meaning. Effectively, life is worse than just empty. It's horrific.
But Mrs. Williams wasn't contemplating cutting her throat, was she?
No, but she was in an extremely distressed state.
I see. Do you accept that since the operation, she has suffered from partial amnesia and that her speech has been slowed?
Yes, the amnesia is temporary. She herself has already stated that there's been much improvement. The slowness of speech merely reflects her comparative calmness.
And do you also accept that there has been a reduction in her learning ability?
Yes, it's marginal.
And that she has a sense of loss of self?
Frankly, I don't understand that. What is a sense of self? There has been some change of personality. She's less aggressive, that's all.
Did you describe to Mrs. Williams the effects that we have been discussing?
I told her the operation would calm her, yes.
No, but did you go into details about how her personality would change, how her emotions would be blunted, how she might become slower and more subdued?
Well, as I've already said, I find your description grossly exaggerated, and so no, I didn't. I didn't, and I still don't think it is necessary.
You mean you didn't think it necessary with a woman?
Oh, dear. You're not back on that track again, are you?
Mr. Maybank, have the majority of your patients been women?
Yes, they have. But that's hardly surprising when you consider that the majority of mental patients are women. And by the way, I have performed amygdalotomies on men.
Now, I gather from an article you have written in the British Journal of Neurosurgery that one of your colleagues had performed a psychosurgical operation on a woman who was suffering from tension and anxiety, who had developed multiple jerks, severe sweating, obsessional tidiness and depression since marrying a sadist. She was exhausted and unable to face meeting people, all since she married a sadist.
The husband was a very violent man, yes. I didn't say he was a sadist. She had a history of tension and anxiety since childhood.
But she had only become a mental patient after her marriage to this violent man.
She was in a state of extreme distress, and the operation, a leucotomy, was very successful.
You mean she was relieved of her symptoms?
Yes, she was.
Well, wouldn't you think that the correct management of a wife made anxious and depressed to that extent by a sadistic husband would have been some kind of treatment of the husband? Possibly an operation on his brain rather than her brain? An amygdalotomy perhaps to control his aggression?
We don't know that his aggression was the cause of her distress.
Well, Mr. Maybank, you did see fit to mention his extreme aggression in your article. Now, surely there is a high probability that this was the cause if he was a sadist and her symptoms started after the marriage.
I did not say that the husband was a sadist. And it wasn't the husband that needed help, it was the wife.
I see. So the husband's violence was accepted by everybody, by society, to such an extent that he wasn't suffering any crippling guilt or depression. He wasn't plagued by fear of hurting someone badly one day. Everything was in order. Is that it?
You would have to talk to her psychiatrist to get the facts.
How many patients have you given amygdalotomies to?
12.
And how many of those 12 were women?
8.
Now, all those patients, I presume, suffered from hyperactive, aggressive or psychotic behavior.
Yes.
Now, don't you think it's strange that the majority of your patients were women when aggressive psychotic behaviour is traditionally associated with men?
Perhaps, but as I've already said, the majority of mental patients are women.
Well, perhaps women are more available for treatment. Perhaps they respond more easily to male authority figures. Perhaps they can be more easily led to believe that they are pathologically ill when they behave in a manner that is associated with male behaviour, especially when that male authority figure is disapproving. Now, I suggest, Mr. Maybank, that in Mrs. Williams' case, this is what happened.
You can suggest what you like, young lady. It isn't true.
TV lawyers.
Mrs. Eileen Shaw, you are the mother of Mrs. Josie Williams.
Yes.
Could you describe your daughter's personality before she had the operation?
Oh, yes, she was dreadful. She nearly drove me to a nervous breakdown. I'm on my own, you see. I'm a widow. And I had to be put on the tranquilizers. I even started to lose a patch of my hair, here at the back of my head. The doctor said it was caused by the worry.
Mrs. Shaw, you were asked to describe your daughter's personality before the operation.
Yes, I know.
Well, will you please answer the question?
Yes, well, I just couldn't cope at all. She used to fly into these terrible rages all the time. And she used to get, violent, hysterical. They weren't just tempers, you see. She'd start screaming and breaking things.
Now, what kind of things used to cause these terrible rages?
Oh, anything. Silly little things. Things that normal people wouldn't even notice.
Could you describe one of these rages?
Yes. Well, I made this little remark once about her personal hygiene. It was about her body smell, you know, the kind of thing. I only said it to help her. I mean, she was never very clean at the best of times, and I thought this might help. I mean, after all, I am her mother. It isn't as if I was a complete stranger or anything. She was never very tidy. Well, not what I call tidy, anyway. And frankly, she was looking a mess. Well, that did it. She just went for me. She knocked me right off my feet onto the floor of my kitchen. She was shouting about disgusting names, calling me names all the time, and screaming that she hated me. She broke my arm. Oh, I was in a terrible state. The doctor was shocked when he saw me.
Was she abnormal when she was a child?
Oh, well, of course, my husband was alive then, and he could always manage her better than I could. She was an only child, you see. Oh, it was criminal to see the distress she caused him.
Mrs. Shaw, can you tell us if her behaviour as a child was different from that of other children?
Oh, well, as I've said, she was always a source of worry to us. She was an only child, you see. I couldn't have any more after her. I mean, I've never been a very healthy woman, and childbirth was too much for me. But the real trouble began when she was in her teens. She was caught shoplifting. Apparently, she'd been at it for about a year before they caught her. She had some very undesirable friends, you see. And when she was had up in that juvenile court, well, you can imagine the shock. I think the shock killed my husband. He had this bad heart, you see, and the worry that she'd caused him was too much for him. He died while she was in the approved school.
And did she have fits of an uncontrollable nature and rage at that time?
What, you mean when she was still in her teens? Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I said to my husband then, I thought that she'd end up being put away. I mean, there were definite signs that she was mental. Other girls of her age were making themselves pretty, you know, and going out on dates and things, doing the things that normal teenage girls do. But not my little girl. Oh, no. She was always, a sulky. She was sullen. She was sullen and moody, and she always did exactly what she wanted. It didn't matter about other people. She also used to hang around with a gang of ruffians and get into fights. Well, I mean, that's not normal in a teenage young girl, is it? We couldn't cope with her at all. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but it was quite a relief when she was put in that approved school. You see, I thought some discipline would do her good. Of course, I didn't know then that she was ill.
You mean mentally ill?
Yes, as Dr. Bryley explained it to me, you see.
Mrs. Shaw, when your daughter was an adult, did she settle down or did she become worse?
Oh, she got worse. Oh, definitely, she got worse. I mean, I have to admit, I was ashamed to be her mother. Terrible time I had of it, you see, because I understand now about her illness. Of course I do, but I mean, at the time, well, I mean, I was a widow. Josie was my only child. Terrible. And then when she left that approved school, didn't come home. Wouldn't come home at all. Then she got married, and I thought, now then, Bill will be able to cope.
Bill was her husband?
Yes, Bill Williams. You see, I thought Bill will be able to control her because that's what she needed. She needed a firm hand to put her in her place. But you see, he went off and left her. I didn't blame him, really. She wasn't a proper wife to him. Not what I call a proper wife, anyway. I mean, most women settle down when they get married, don't they? She didn't. Their place was always a disgusting mess. I went round there once to clean it up. Never again. She had one of her scenes and she threw me out, slammed the door on me just like that. Of course, how those children of hers have survived, I shall never know.
Mrs. Shaw, have you met Dr. Reedman?
Yes, I have. Just once. Once was enough.
Now, do you feel that your daughter benefited in any way from her time at Wesley Hall?
No, I do not. Not one bit. All this family therapy business. People like Dr. Reedman try to break up families.
What do you mean by that, Mrs. Shaw?
She calls herself a doctor. No more a doctor than I am, not in my book. She did her level best to turn my daughter against me, and she's doing it again. When my daughter came out of that hospital after that operation, she was a changed woman. Dr. Bryley had cured her, and I shall be eternally grateful to him. Then she gets it into her head to see this Dr. Reedman person, and all this happens. I think it's disgusting that two decent, distinguished men should be dragged through this.
Now, you've said your daughter had been better since the operation. Would you describe in what way she's been better?
Every way. I mean, she doesn't have those awful rages anymore. That's a blessing, I can tell you. Things had gone on the way they were going, I'd have ended up in the North Cliff with her, I'm sure of that.
Now, have you noticed any changes for the worse?
No. No. And nor had she till she met that Dr. Reedman. And all this memory thing. Did she tell you she keeps losing them? I think she's making it up.
Thank you, Mrs. Shaw.
Mrs. Shaw, isn't shoplifting quite normal behaviour in an insecure adolescent who feels unhappy or unloved?
My daughter was never unloved.
How well did you know Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Shaw?
How well did... She's my daughter.
No, but how well did you know her?
Of course I knew her.
But you say that when she came out of approved school, she didn't come home. She got on with her own life, independent of you. She didn't seek out your company or advice, did she, Mrs. Shaw? In fact, she avoided you. Weren't you always highly critical of her, and didn't she find your company upsetting?
My daughter was ill.
So you have said several times. Do you mean she was mad?
Yes.
Well, nothing you have said about Mrs. Williams would suggest that she was mad. Didn't you, in fact, decide that Mrs. Williams was mad to justify the fact that you didn't like what she was?
You've been influenced by that Dr. Reedman as well, I can tell.
Just answer Counsel's question, Mrs. Shaw.
But she's making it sound as if I wanted my daughter to be ill. What mother wants that of an only child? This has all been a terrible ordeal for me. She wasn't a proper daughter, not the way she was carrying on. Perhaps you haven't got any children, Your Lordship. You don't know what it's like being a mother. If my daughter hadn't been ill, they wouldn't have put her in the mental hospitals, would they?
Mrs. Shaw, did she ever attack her children?
I'm not certain.
You mean the answer is no?
But it would have come to that. I'm certain of that.
You can't be certain of that, Mrs. Shaw. In fact, wouldn't it appear that when she did get violent, she expressed her violence towards people she may well have had good reason to be angry with?
When I get angry with somebody, I don't attack them like she did. Just like her grandfather. I think she got it from him.
You mean her grandfather was violent?
My husband's father, not mine. He was very excitable, but then he had a lot of burdens. He had a wife and 8 children to support.
And he was a man. Did he ever go into a mental hospital?
No, of course he didn't. He wasn't ill. I only said he had a bad temper.
So your father-in-law wasn't mad, but your daughter was?
Yes, she was.
I see. Now, would you say that before the operation, your daughter had what could be described as a fighting spirit?
I certainly wouldn't describe my daughter's illness like that, no.
But it could have been described as a fighting spirit.
I suppose it could.
Well, you say she was restless, energetic, moody, given to tantrums, all characteristics of a very spirited person. Now, we have heard that since the operation, your daughter's personality has become slower, she has become more subdued and hesitant, and she finds it difficult to respond in conversation in the way that she used to. Have you noticed these changes in her personality?
She's a much nicer person now, yes.
So you agree these changes in her personality have happened?
She's much better, yes.
I would suggest to you that these are not changes for the better, and that your daughter's personality has been unnecessarily blunted. Now, Mrs. Shaw, did you want her to have the operation?
Yes, I did.
Weren't you worried about your daughter having a major operation on her brain?
No. I trusted Dr. Bryley.
So you weren't worried about your daughter's welfare at all?
I said I trusted Dr. Bryley, and I was at the end of my tether. Dr. Bryley will tell you.
So you wanted her to have the operation to benefit you?
No. I wanted it for her, so she'd get better, be a normal person.
You mean the person you think she ought to be?
No. Just normal.
Thank you. I have no further questions, my lord.
And I remind you, members of the jury, that a surgical operation is lawful if it is carried out for the benefit of the patient, if the prospective benefits outweigh the risks, and if the patient, or in the case of a child, the parent, consents to it. Now you have to decide, on the evidence which you heard, whether the results of these operations are so unpredictable or so harmful that they should never be carried out at all. And you also have to decide whether Mrs. Williams was capable of understanding the nature and the possible consequences of the operation when she consented to it. Will you now please retire and consider your verdict?
Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Answer this question yes or no. Have you reached verdicts on which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the accused, David Andrew Maybank, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Do you find the accused, Alan Bryley, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Dr. Bryley, Mr. Maybank, you are free to go. I understand that this matter has already been referred to the disciplinary committee of your profession, and therefore you will face another trial in which the issues will not be issues of law, but issues of morality and medical practice. However, you have been acquitted here, and so an order must be made for costs to be borne by Dr. Reedman. Very well, you may go.
The cases in Fulchester are fictitious. You can join us again when our cameras return to bring you another leading case in the Crown Court.